Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Raymer-Brown and I am playing Annie Sullivan in the Theatre Downstream's upcoming production of The Miracle Worker, and there are a few things that I've learned about Annie and Helen that I'd like to share with you all. Helen Adams Keller is best known today for being deaf-blind. More than a few people have hopefully heard of the play The Miracle Worker, written by William Gibson. The Broadway version of the play starred Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke, who both then went on to star in the film of the same name, and who both went on to win Oscars in 1963 for their performances. Bancroft as Best Actress, and Duke as Best Supporting Actress. Gibson based the drama in large part on Helen's first autobiography, The Story of My Life. The title of The Miracle Worker was a name first given to Annie Sullivan by Mark Twain, an admirer of the two women, who also helped arrange the financial reality of Helen's college education at Radcliffe. We at the Theatre Downstream will take our turn presenting this heart-rending drama February 23rd through 26, 2017. Before we take the stage this coming weekend, we wanted to take the opportunity to introduce our potential audience to the two women who have impacted history in such a profound way. In part one, we'll speak briefly about both women and their lives before meeting. But we'll talk a bit more about the lesser-known Annie, and end our story shortly after they meet, as this is where the play ends their story. But in truth, this is where their story actually begins. Helen and Annie's lives would continue to intertwine for the next 50 years. In part two, we'll share an interview with Kennedy Brown, the 11-year-old actress playing Helen, who will be performing in her first lead role. Helen Keller was born a perfectly normal, healthy baby on June 27, 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Her parents were retired Army Captain Arthur Keller and his second wife, Kate. Helen had a younger brother, Phillips Brooks, and a sister, Mildred. She also had two older half-brothers, William Simpson Keller and James Keller. Her father was a cotton plantation owner and the editor of a popular news weekly, the North Alabamian. At the age of 19 months, Helen became very ill with a high fever, leaving her totally deaf and blind. Doctors at that time diagnosed it as brain fever, or acute congestion of the stomach and brain. Experts today believe she suffered from scarlet fever or meningitis. By age 6 or 7, Helen had invented nearly 60 hand gestures to communicate with her parents and ask for things, but she still didn't know how to express herself, which frustrated her to the point of violent tantrums. As strange as it sounds, Annie and Helen may never have met if it wasn't for Charles Dickens. He traveled the Northeast from January to June of 1842 and recorded his experiences in a travelogue called American Notes. It was here that Helen's mother read about Dickens' experience meeting Laura Bridgman, the first deaf-blind person that had been taught to read and write by a man named Dr. Samuel Howe. After Helen nearly killed her infant sister by attempting to dump her out of her cradle, her parents were at their wits' end for a solution. It was then that Kate convinced her husband to try and contact this Dr. Howe. Unfortunately, by the time Kate read Dickens' account and Captain Keller contacted the institution, Dr. Howe had been dead for several years. However, his successor at the Perkins Institute for the Blind, Michael Anagnos, suggested his star pupil, Annie Sullivan. Before I continue with Annie Sullivan's history, parents may want to preview the next section before letting their younger children hear. Annie experienced some pretty traumatic things in her childhood. Joanna Mansfield Sullivan was Helen's teacher, companion, and friend for nearly 50 years. She was born April 14th, 1866 in Feeding Hills, Massachusetts, to poor Irish immigrants. She was one of 5 children, but 2 died in infancy. At the age of 5, Annie contracted trachoma, a contagious conjunctivitis that attacks the eyes, and was left almost entirely blind. She later received several eye operations that restored some of her vision. Her mother Alice was sickly as well and died of complications from both a fall and tuberculosis when Annie was only 8. Her alcoholic, physically abusive father, Thomas, was left to care for the remaining 3 children, and after a short time of unsuccessful parenting, abandoned his family. Annie's sister was sent to live with relatives, possibly because she was the healthiest. But half-blind Annie and her sickly younger brother Jimmy were sent to the Tewksbury Almshouse, which was an asylum for the poor, sick, and insane. The almshouse was filthy and overcrowded. They attempted to separate Annie and Jimmy, but Annie threw such a violent fit at the possibility of separation that they allowed Jimmy to stay with her in the women's ward. However, he was forced to wear a dress to hide his gender. The two children would often play in the dead house, the place where the dead bodies of the almshouse residents were kept before burial. Jimmy died from tuberculosis of the hip just months after they arrived there, leaving Annie utterly alone. While she was living there, Annie heard rumors about schools for the blind from the other inmates, and she decided education was her only way to escape this poverty. The years tracked on, and one day, due to the overwhelming smell of the almshouse, plus extreme rumors about what was actually happening to the inmates, such as sexually perverted practices and even cannibalism, a special commission was finally sent by the State Board of Charities to investigate. When the commission arrived, Annie followed them around all day. Unable to distinguish one man from another due to her eyesight, and hearing that a Mr. Sanborn was the man she needed to address, Annie finally flung herself at the group, crying, "Mr. Sanborn, Mr. Sanborn, I want to go to school." She was 14. Annie would later write a collection of thoughts called Foolish Remarks of a Foolish Woman. Of her time at Tewksbury, she wrote, "Unexpected good has filled the chinks of frustration in my life. But at times melancholy without reason grips me as in a vice. A word, an odd inflection, the way somebody crosses the street, brings all the past before me with such amazing clearness and completeness, my heart stops beating for a moment. Then everything around me seems as it was so many years ago. Even the ugly frame buildings are revived. Again I see the unsightly folk who hobbled, cursed, fed and snored like animals. I shiver recalling how I looked upon scenes of vile exposure. The open heart of a derelict is not a pleasant thing. I doubt if life, or eternity for that matter, is long enough to erase the errors and ugly blots scored upon my brain by those dismal years." This account leads me to believe that today, Annie would be diagnosed as having clear symptoms of PTSD. Annie left the asylum to attend Perkins School for the Blind in 1880, the year Helen was born, and underwent surgery to try and correct as much of her vision as possible. Because of her upbringing, or lack of upbringing, Annie had trouble at the school. She was ignorant, socially inept, and had a fiery temper. She challenged the rules at every opportunity, and was often in trouble with her teachers. But she was also extraordinarily bright, and eventually did settle down. She developed close friendships with a few of the other students and teachers, including the director of the school, Michael Anagnos. Annie was selected as valedictorian of her class in 1886, quite an accomplishment for a girl who couldn't even spell her own name 6 years previously. Part of her valedictorian speech read, "Duty bids us go forth into active life. Let us go cheerfully, hopefully, and earnestly, and set ourselves to find our especial part. When we have found it, willingly and faithfully perform it. For every obstacle we overcome, every success we achieve, tends to bring man closer to God." And here is where our two lives converge and Annie finds her life's work. In March 1887, Annie, racked with uncertainty, but filled with determination, travels by train from Boston to Alabama. Before leaving, she studied the teaching methods used by Dr. Howe with Laura Bridgman. By this time, Laura was over 50 years old, and in those 50 years, No other teacher had succeeded in duplicating the success that Dr. Howe had achieved in teaching Laura how to communicate. But no amount of studying could have prepared Annie for the cyclone of anger, violence, frustration, and latent intelligence that was Helen. It all had a very familiar feeling. It could be argued that Annie was simply seeing herself just 6 years earlier, before education had set her free. When Annie arrived, she attempted to teach Helen the manual alphabet and how to communicate by spelling what she wanted with her fingers. Her method was to treat Helen as much like a seeing child as possible. She knew from experience that the only escape for Helen from the prison of her mind was language. After about a month of intense emotional and physical struggle, including the loss of 2 teeth, a now famous fight at the breakfast table, and innumerable cuts and bruises from her pupil, it was at a water pump that Helen finally understood the connection of objects having names and what those names were. After this miracle of understanding, her vocabulary increased to hundreds of words and simple sentences very quickly. Annie also taught Helen how to read Braille and raise type, and to print block letters. By age 9, Helen began to learn to speak and read lips, skills she attempted to refine the rest of her life. Helen also attended Perkins School for the Blind for 4 years. She then spent a year at the Cambridge School for Young Ladies to prepare for Radcliffe College. In 1904, she graduated cum laude from Radcliffe and became the first person with deaf-blindness to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. Later, Helen was the first woman to be awarded an honorary degree from Harvard University. Helen became an American author, political activist, outspoken suffragist, advocate of workers' rights, and an opponent of child labor. She dedicated the bulk of her life to achieving laws for the education and protection of the deaf-blind, programs for the prevention of blindness, and state-assisted programs to help people with disabilities with job training and placement. She also received numerous awards throughout her life for her humanitarian efforts. In 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson awarded Keller the highest American honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. On the 50th anniversary of her graduation from Radcliffe College, she received the Alumni Achievement Award. Radcliffe also dedicated the Helen Keller Garden in her honor and named a fountain in the garden for her teacher, Anne Sullivan. Helen later received Brazil's Order of the Southern Cross, the Philippines' Golden Heart, Japan's Sacred Treasure, and in 1991 was named one of the most important people of the 20th century by Life magazine. All of these accomplishments are because an impoverished, fiery, determined, half-blind Irish orphan with only 6 years of formal education succeeded where no one else could in breaking through the darkness of a young, deaf-blind girl's mind. We end part 1 with a quote from Helen's autobiography, The Story of My Life. "My teacher is so near to me that I scarcely think of myself apart from her. How much of my delight in all beautiful things is innate, and how much is due to her influence, I can never tell. I feel that her being is inseparable from my own, and that the footsteps of my life are hers. All the best of me belongs to her. There is not a talent or an aspiration or a joy in me that has not been awakened by her loving touch." Part 2 is a live recording of the interview between myself and Kennedy Brown about her experience playing Helen Keller.
Hi, I'm Kennedy Brown, and I play Helen Keller in the upcoming Theatre Downstream show, Miracle Worker.
Very nice. And what have you done with Theatre Downstream before this?
I've been in The First Holiday Homecoming, It's Complicated, Beauty and the Beast, and Mary Poppins.
Do you have a favorite past role?
I really liked being Gladys Herdman with the high school in Best Christmas Pageant Ever.
Wasn't that your first part?
Yes.
And how old were you?
I was 7.
What did you know about Helen Keller before the show, and what do you know now?
Before the show, all I'd really done was watch the old black and white Miracle Worker movie, but Ashley gave me some books to read about her, and I know a little more about her, and that's helped me with some actions in the show and vocalization.
How did it help you? What did you use when you read it? What did you learn about her?
The author used really descriptive words that helped me kind of picture what it looked like and what it sounded like for her.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember the name of the books that you read?
Miss Spitfire, and I am getting on the second one, the biography of Helen Keller.
It's the story of my life, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What has been your favorite part of the show and why?
Probably the breakfast scene.
Yeah.
Because I get to do a lot of action, and that's probably my favorite part of the whole thing is whenever I get to throw a fit.
Because you don't do that in real life, right?
Yeah, I don't do that.
How does it feel to have an understudy?
Well, at first, I was like, oh, I have an understudy. Once I watched my understudy do the part, sometimes I learned things, and it helped me whenever I was up there because I kind of used a little bit of what she did and what I had before, and it helped me to make it look really good.
I think this is the first time we've ever had an understudy for any of our plays.
I think so, too. I don't remember having an understudy.
How does it feel to have a lead role? Is this your first lead role?
Well, I guess you could say Gladys Herman was a lead role. I've been in some ensembles, and I've never really had like a main lead role, but I have had speaking parts before, so this is probably the first lead role.
So how does it feel?
It feels pretty good to, it's pretty busy, but I like coming to all the practices and having to have memorization, no line memorization, but
right, I was
walking.
going to ask you about that. Do you think it's harder to play Helen without lines, or do you think it would be harder to have lines? Which you've done both now, so which has been more difficult, to have no lines but have to memorize all action, or to have lines?
Probably having lines, because with action I can kind of see it in my head, and with lines I don't have like a photographic memory or anything, so I can't remember. I have to go over them a lot.
Yeah. What do you think the audience will enjoy about this show?
Well, I think they'll really like the breakfast scene because it's funny. And I think they'll also like, of course, the end when the miracle happens. And I think they'll also like when Ashley has a lot of lines that are full of emotion, and she does a really good job with that.
Thank you. Do you have a favorite line of Annie's, or a favorite part, any particular emotional part that you like the best?
Well, I like at the end when she says, "I love Helen." That's really sweet.
Yeah, it is. What's been the hardest part?
Probably the sounds that I have to make, because at first I didn't make any at all. I didn't know what it was supposed to sound like. And from the movie, I knew that it was a lot of grunts, so I kind of started off with that, and I kind of worked from there.
Was it difficult to come up with the grunts, or did you just kind of go with your gut?
I practiced sometimes at home, and my mom and dad would listen to me, and sometimes they'd be like, "No," and sometimes they'd say, "That sounds pretty good."
That's funny. What do you think of your co-star Ashley? And Kennedy came up with these questions herself. So, what do you think of me, Kennedy, as your co-star?
I'm glad. Like when we had auditions and we found out that I was gonna be Helen and she was gonna be Annie, I called her and I remember exactly what I said. I said, "I'm glad that you're Annie, so I don't have to feel weird."
Yes, it's been very fun. It's been very, very fun. And I would say the way I feel about you is it's been such a joy because I've seen you grow up on stage. So to me, it's been so fun to watch you really come into this role and really have fun with the part. And for me, as a person who gets a lot of stage fright, I still get stage fright, but your enthusiasm for the role and your excitement for opening night is making me not so terrified of opening night. So that's been helpful for me, and it's been fun to work and do this together because I feel like we make a really good team, and I'm glad that your mother understands that you're never injured. I'm getting injured, but you've never gotten injured. What would you like to tell the audience to be aware of before the show?
Well, at the end of the show, if they're in the front row, I'd say beware, you're in the splash zone and in front of the pump. And also something about Captain Keller, to not judge him so much because he seems kind of harsh, but inside I think he does love Helen. And Annie too, she just seems really like straightforward and like
kind of mean almost.
Yeah, kind of really strict and like, all right, what does this word mean? And in the end, she really does love Helen.
She does. Well, let me ask you that. how do you think Helen feels about her mother, and how do you feel about your co-star mother? So let's do that in two different things. How do you think Helen feels about her mom?
I think she really trusts her because she doesn't like when Annie tries to give her a kiss or hug her too much, touch her and give a bunch of emotion a lot, but she will take that from her mom, I guess, because she's not quite so used to Annie. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, like, if she gets older, if she doesn't mind it, but I know when she's young, she just probably trusts her mom more.
Okay, and how do you feel working with the lady playing your mother, Candy? How's that been?
Oh, that's been good. She is so good with her, like, her emotion as well, and every time she hugs me or whatever, I just feel like, and she says, like, put her in a cage?
Yeah.
That just makes me want to cry.
So how do you think that Helen feels about her dad?
I think she trusts him. She doesn't like to give him too much love, and kind of like with Annie, but she will let him, like, give her a hug. Yeah. That doesn't happen, I don't think, very often, but if he did, I think she would probably let him.
And they probably had different relationships back in those days with fathers and children versus mothers and children. I think the mothers were always the nurturers, and I don't know if the fathers were too nurturing with their kids back then. So now, how do you feel about working with Brian, the guy that's playing your father? Because you've been in several plays with him now, right?
Mm-hmm. And I feel good with him because I know he picks me up sometimes, and I'm like, I trust him because I know he won't drop me.
That's important.
Yeah. And because he, like you said, I've been in a few plays with him, so I know enough about him so that I trust him too.
Yeah. Is there any other characters you want to say anything about that you interact with? What about James? How do you think Helen feels about her brother?
I don't think she pays him too much attention.
He's just there.
Yeah, he's just there.
Yeah.
She steals his bacon, and he doesn't. I don't think he's too happy about that.
No.
So I don't think she cares about his feelings as much.
No. So how do you feel about William that plays your brother?
I haven't really been in a whole lot of plays with him, but he seems really nice, and he always tells me I do a good job.
Yeah, that's important. Is there anything else you want to talk about with Helen and Annie? How did you like the movie?
I really liked it because I was like, every time Helen would bite somebody or scratch them, I'd be like, ooh, and I'd be like really in the moment. I'd be like on the edge of my seat, like she might punch somebody, and I'd be like, oh, no, you did it.
So it was a lot more action-packed than you thought.
Yeah.
Do you feel like people, when they come to see the show, are not going to realize how much action is in this show? I think people feel like this is a very sweet, sentimental, kind of dramatic story, and there's a lot of physical action in this.
Yeah, I think people are gonna expect, like, she'll come and Helen will fall in love with her and they'll teach, and then a miracle. But it's a lot of struggling. Yes. And I also think most people think that this is a serious show, and they're like, oh, I'd much rather see a musical where they're singing and dancing. But this show is actually really funny. There's some really funny stuff in it.
It does have a lot of funny stuff. I've said often that all the action happens in Act 1 and all the talking happens in Act 2.
Yeah.
It's almost farcical at one point when Annie gets locked in her room and they have to get a ladder to get her out, and she climbs out, and it's very, very funny. So I really enjoy watching that part. I'm locked in my room, but I enjoy watching all the actors running around, and it's very funny.
It's very busy. Mm-hmm. It's a busy scene.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this question. Why do you think that this story is important? Why should people care about Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan? What do you think is the reason they should come see this show?
Well, it's kind of inspiring to some people. Like, some people might have a disability or something, and they think, oh, I can't do as much. And it's really good to see, because another message in it is that it's always good to help people. Mm-hmm. Like, Annie is constantly helping Helen, and she's really devoted to her. So it's really important it gives you the message of helping others, and that's important too.
What is the biggest thing you've learned from playing Helen?
That there's a time and a place for letting all your inner anger out, and that patience is always the better way around.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else you want to say?
Come see the show.
Perfect. Thank you, Kennedy. The Theatre Downstream proudly presents The Miracle Worker for 4 performances only. February 23rd and 24th at 7 p.m., February 25th at 1 o'clock p.m., and February 26th at 3 o'clock p.m. Tickets can be ordered in advance from www.thetheatredownstream.com.